The financial incentives to destroy nature have always been clearer than the ones to protect it. We can't address climate change without addressing the biodiversity crisis. By destroying nature, you reduce the planet's ability to absorb carbon and protect us from the changes in the climate, and climate change also exacerbates biodiversity.
Megan Pillsbury is an engineer, entrepreneur, and innovator on a mission to reinvent the private sector. Her career spans tech, startups, sustainability, and financial services. She orchestrated the business development strategy for the climate service, paving the way for its acquisition by S&P.
Climate has dominated the sustainability agenda for many years. But we're now seeing a real shift. Nature and biodiversity are coming into the center of the conversation, which I believe is very important. Now, my question to you is, what is driving that shift, and why is nature risk becoming impossible for businesses to ignore?
I think we've spoken a lot about supply chains, we've spoken a lot about risk, which is obviously very important. But I'm curious, beyond risk mitigation, where do you see some real commercial opportunities for companies that do prioritize biodiversity?
One of the best examples today is the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. You have all of these fossil fuel energy sources that are stuck and not able to go to the countries that need them for energy. And you have this realization amongst countries to realize that a highly concentrated global economy is a high-risk global economy, because if you have just a few channels to key supplies and one or more of those channels becomes disrupted, everything can stop. Well, I don't want to say everything stops, but everything gets hard for a bit.
This biodiversity loss, right, it affects regions that are economically vulnerable, and they are communities with the least power when it comes to the global supply chain and least representation in corporate boardroom. How do you think companies should think about their responsibility when it comes to managing these nature-related risks? And do you think there's a justice dimension to this? Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of the Sustainability and Climate Podcast. I remain the one and only, the phenomenal, what again can I use? Anyways, I remain the phenomenal Oluwatobi Aigbogun. And as always, I have the one and only, the delectable, the amazing Labake, who's giving us a new hairstyle today. Hi, Labake. How you doing?
Hi, Toby. Hi, everybody. I am well, thank you. I'm well. How are you? I'm coming off a sore throat and a cold, so my voice is huskier than usual. Audience, let me know if I should keep. I was about to make a reference to a Friends episode with Phoebe, but I won't. But I won't. But yeah, I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good. Busy as usual. A lot going on, but we're pushing it. How have you been? How's the magazine going?
The magazine is doing really well. We're working on our 7th issue, which I can't believe we're already at the 7th issue. Oh, yeah. Time is flying. Yeah, so working on our 7th issue, which is the energy issue. Energy is a hot topic right now. Yeah. Everyone's talking about it. So the magazine is exploring kind of Africa's strategic position within this global conversation. So I'm really excited about it. Busy times. Looking forward to the upcoming summer. Hopefully I get to have a summer.
Yeah. Awesome.
But yeah, things are going well. How about you?
How's work? Yeah, work is great. Great things happening. A lot of incredible things happening, which we'll be announcing very soon. But yeah, it's been good. It's been good busy, if I'll put it that way. And I'm excited about the new phase of my life, my career. In general. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to what the future holds.
Yeah, we're all excited. We're all excited to get all the updates and all the news.
Yeah. Guys, I'll put Labake on the spot.
Oh my!
And I guess at the right time she'll say it. But Labake has the news for us. But when she thinks it's the right time, she will let us know. And that is what I will say for now.
Okay. We'll think about what this news is. And you have to come back to the next episode to hear it. How about that?
Yes, exactly. So she has promised you guys in the next episode, she'll share the news with us. You see? Simple and clear.
Yes. Today's episode, we have an incredible guest. So you want to stay tuned. We'll be back. Megan Pillsbury is an engineer, entrepreneur, and innovator on a mission to reinvent the private sector. She's the founder and CEO of Dunya Analytics, the leading digital platform for science-based risk analytics, in biodiversity and nature. Her career spans tech, startups, sustainability, and financial services, including innovation and fintech leadership roles at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. She orchestrated the business development strategy for the climate service, paving the way for its acquisition by S&P Global. She also directs the Eco-Entrepreneurship Program at the University of Delaware, sits on the board of Enrich, a non-profit offering financial literacy education to migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong, holds an MBA from INSEAD, and an MS in electrical engineering from the University of Michigan.
All right, welcome, Megan, to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. And I'll just go straight into the conversation, right? Climate has dominated the sustainability agenda for many years. And we've had the conferences, the frameworks, the capitals, the headline. But we're now seeing a real shift. Nature and biodiversity are coming into the center of the conversation, which I believe is very important. Now, my question to you is, what is driving that shift? And why is nature risks becoming impossible for businesses to ignore?
If you look back at why climate came onto the stage as important for companies to pay attention to and kind of created this trend towards now more companies are measuring and disclosing both their impacts and contributions to climate change as well as their risks related to climate change. It all kind of goes back to the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, right? So that agreement where 190 some countries all agreed collectively they needed to work on climate. It kicked off a whole set of infrastructure and obligations to address climate. And that extended into the private sector. It created opportunities. In 2022, the Kunming-Montreal Agreement was signed, and it's kind of like the parallel to the Paris Agreement, but for biodiversity. So like with the Paris Agreement, there was this target of the world limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Similarly, with the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, there's a global target of restoring and protecting 30% of land and oceans by 2030. So now, that was in 2022, 196 countries have signed up to this commitment around protecting biodiversity, and now you're seeing all of this infrastructure fall into place to achieve those goals. And additionally, Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, that is what came out of that agreement, obliges companies or obliges countries to require companies to disclose and act on protecting biodiversity and protecting nature. So I think probably the biggest motivator is the global Kunming-Montreal Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed in 2022. And that's really when we saw all of this kick off. That was when the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures was established or announced, I should say, providing guidance to companies on how to do nature risk assessment. But we're essentially following in the footsteps of, what happened with climate. And now many companies have been on the climate journey and know that nature is like the rest of the story, I will say. It's not really a different story, it's the same story. I think we also have realized in the climate journey that we can't address climate change without addressing the biodiversity crisis. They are essentially two sides of the same coin. By destroying nature, you reduce the planet's ability to absorb carbon and protect us from the changes in the climate. And climate change also exacerbates biodiversity. So they really come together. Also, like many of the climate initiatives around tree planting, we're more focused on how many trees can we get out and claim rather than proper ecosystem restoration, which is really where the climate benefits are achieved is through strong ecosystems. And then I guess the third reason is that we're literally bumping up against planetary boundaries, right? We're seeing food value chains and food supply chains becoming increasingly volatile. We're seeing an increase of health impacts on people because they're having a hard time, getting access to clean water. They're being poisoned by the toxins that we're putting in the environment. And then even like hot industries like AI is struggling to grow because these data centers need water. Water comes from healthy ecosystems, right? It doesn't fall out of the sky into a data center. It goes into an ecosystem where it's collected, it's cleaned, and it's stored so that it can be provided on demand. So, because that water is being harder to find in a systematic way, these are now becoming much more prominent topics for us as a society to think about, and then by extension for companies to think about as well.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question to that, right? So earlier this year, the IPBES report came out. So the IPBES is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, if I'm correct. And they released a report that is called a landmark global assessment, where it's like the business about that. So where do you think this report comes into this conversation?
I think this report is valuable because of the role that the IPBES plays in providing the scientific leadership and authority about how important this is. Um, the IPBES also has a podcast, actually, and I was learning a bit about them on that, where they don't have the same mandate that the IPCC does. So the IPCC actually has a mandate to recommend policy, whereas the IPBES does not. So they more have to address these things through their scientific leadership and kind of recommending practical steps or connecting dots between the science and actions that people can take without being explicitly recommending certain policies and things like that. But I also think it's interesting. We've seen a number of organizations and agencies, including the IPBES, who have come out with guidelines and recommendations and scientific information that all kind of point to the same critical ideas, right? Companies are having a very significant impact on nature that companies have a very significant dependence on for economic success and survival, right? And so there's a feedback loop where companies are not, well, let me put it this way. The financial incentives to destroy nature have always been clearer than the ones to protect it. And that's why all of this infrastructure is now falling into place. It's like, look, this loss of nature is not just a thing that we should think about from a society because it's the right thing to do. But it actually, if you're just focused on the money, it presents risks to our economic success, like globally as a global society, but as local societies, and also for businesses, right? Businesses need water, they need natural resources. A lot of companies don't think that they have dependence on nature, but if you look one or two levels down in their supply chain, they have enormous dependence on nature. But that connection or that connecting the dots between the science and the financial impacts to companies has never been clear. And all of these reports, including the IPBES report, are trying to point to that to say, look, actually, there's a very strong correlation here between ecosystem health and business health. And now's the time to act in order to protect your business and reduce the impacts to protect your business.
I completely agree. And I was going to say before Toby asked that I really love when you say nature is the rest of the story. I think that's really important, working in the sustainability and climate space, this conversation or this idea of living out nature when it very much is a part of the story and a part of the conversation. But similar to kind of the climate space, right? Measurement is, one of the challenges that a lot of companies face. And so biodiversity and the nature space is inherently complex and kind of location specific and, has similar difficulties. How do you help companies, or how do you translate that complexity into decision level insights that a supply chain leader or an executive within an organization can actually use?
First of all, I think there's a little bit of confusion around the term biodiversity. Many people, when they hear the term biodiversity, they think about species and animals, and so they don't immediately connect the dots to their business. But if you in this space, biodiversity is kind of a proxy for ecosystem health, right? That's where the natural resources come from. That's where the ecosystem services come from, are healthy ecosystems. And biodiversity, or being able to measure and assess the level or the quality of biodiversity, or the status of biodiversity, is a good indicator of how healthy that ecosystem is. So when you start losing the species, it's either an indicator of the ecosystem is in decline, or the ecosystem will be in decline, because those are a critical component of the ecosystem. And then ecosystems are super complex. So in climate, we have these wonderful models from the IPCC that go out to 2100 and cover different scenarios and cover every part on the planet. And I mean, they're relatively easy to deal with. You kind of still need to be a climate scientist in order to work with the models appropriately, but they're universally agreed as like the best science that there is. We don't have those models for nature. And to your point, Labake, like, I think of climate as the first amongst 13 pillars in nature. So already nature is everything else, and therefore it's complex. Nature is ecosystem specific, and we don't have, like, it's hard to model one ecosystem, let alone all the ecosystems that make up the planet, and they're all different and they're all unique. So having kind of a global set of models that represents all ecosystems is near impossible, if not impossible today with today's technology. So the challenges around, well, how do you assess, especially if you're a global business and you operate in multiple ecosystems around the world, how do you understand your impacts and dependencies on nature in a way that you can take action? That's why we've developed Dunya Analytics, to connect those dots. Within nature, you have a lot of different data sets that all tell a different story. They were all built to answer a different question. And so what we've done is kind of scooped, the world's best data sets, evaluated them, understood how they, like, what kinds of questions they answer, and then bring them together to tell a story about what's happening in any ecosystem anywhere on the planet. It follows the guidelines from the Task Force for Nature-Related Financials Disclosure. So it's very comprehensively aligned to that. And I think that framework does a good job in trying to encompass all the ways that we need to think about ecosystems in order to qualify, their importance and what's happening in them, and how to understand that relationship with them. So all of that tells a very complicated story of nature is complex, it's local, it's diverse, there's not, enough data. At the same time, there's too much data and it's hard to navigate. We've simplified all of that, and I think how companies need to address that, because it can be very intimidating to go and pick up and be like, well, how do we assess nature when we've got so much complexity? Don't go looking for the exact right answers of super high resolution, like this is the exact perfect thing. We need to focus on the right level of understanding to drive the right actions, to have positive outcomes for nature in a way that is also in line with businesses' objectives and incentives, right? And that is all possible. So what we've done is we've, again, brought together all of this data and have connected it to what it means for the business, both from an impact risk perspective and a dependency risk perspective. But it's just the right level of information to help companies understand where they need to focus, how urgent and important each of those risk areas is, and how they should prioritize next steps and allocate capital in order to address those risks.
Now, you've spoken about Dunya Analytics, right? And I saw yesterday you're now integrating the IPBES data directly into your platform, which will basically give companies the ability to assess hundreds of locations in seconds, which I believe is a very remarkable technical achievement. But technology is only part of the challenge, right? And adoption is where there are so many tools that eat a wall. What resistance have you seen, or are you seeing from companies when it comes to actually integrating biodiversity analytics into their decision?
Probably the first barrier is the complexity. challenge. So if you pick up the TNFD guidance, it is very overwhelming. And when you're a company and you're already dealing with so many complex risks like cybersecurity risks, AI, sourcing risks, climate risks, right? And then you pick up something as complicated as the TNFD, you're like, how can we possibly get started on this? So that's one. I think that holds a lot of people back. And when they see our solution and how much it simplifies the understanding nature, they're like, okay, this is approachable. So having kind of an awareness of the solutions that are out there that can help bridge this complexity gap will help, but definitely complexity is a barrier. Another really big barrier is incentives. Both the incentives to require companies to look into this, but also the incentives that companies inherently have to address this. So I think many companies underestimate the level of risk exposure that they have. And what we've seen with all of our customers, I saw this, I worked previously in climate risk. We see it in nature risk. Companies go in with, finally, they have an incentive or a motive. Somebody's asking them to do the risk assessment. And they're like, okay, well, we need to check this box. They do the risk assessment and then they uncover material risks to the business and are like, okay, wow, we didn't realize the level of exposure was so high. We want to now do something about this. We need to do something about this to protect our business, to protect our jobs. And until they do that assessment, it's really hard to get a good idea of what those risks look like and the fact that they can be addressed, they can be measured, right? It's actually very empowering to do a risk assessment and understand where your vulnerabilities are and understand that you can take action to protect the business from those vulnerabilities. And it's just like creates a deeper level of understanding and control within the business. The other incentive is some companies don't want to know, especially on the impact side, right? They know that they are, or they know that they are potentially having some material impacts to businesses. And I saw this in climate. I've had this question in nature as well. Like, what if we don't want to assess that much? Because if we know about it, we have to do something about it. And this is a real concern, like with people in companies, like they want to do the right thing. So I don't think there's anyone evil out there who's like, oh, we want to pretend like we don't know about this. But it's more like I'm so overwhelmed with all the work I have to do in my job. And if I discover this other new thing, like how am I possibly going to fit it into all the other stuff I have to do? So that's probably, I would think, the biggest driver. But there's also a lot of, the sooner we know about this, the sooner we're going to have to deal with it. And sometimes dealing with these impacts is expensive, right? And the seemingly affordable thing to do is to exploit nature and destroy nature. But again, that comes with a lot of hidden risks around accountability, and the accountability is increasing, and the accountability brings a lot of costs like litigation, reputation impacts, and even prison time for executives, right? A lot of companies or corporate executives think that they're protected by the corporate, what do you call it, umbrella or shield. But many of these, like ecocide incidences, there's this term ecocide, which is like massive or significant ecosystem destruction, can actually penetrate that corporate shield and hold individual executives accountable. Similarly, board members, right? Once a company is successfully sued for damages, then the shareholders can sue board members for not having assessed and managed those risks. 'Cause that's what the board is supposed to do, is help senior leaders understand and be challenged around risks and financial and management and governance, right? So there's all these hidden risks in there that are simply underestimated, or people are trying to avoid looking at them because that's how they make money right now, is through the ecosystem destruction. And then the last part is just around the technical challenges around the data. And again, there's solutions out there now, ours, others, other approaches that can get past the technical challenges and the complexity challenges.
Awesome. I love that conversation because it leads me perfectly into my question, which is around companies understanding their risks within the supply chain. right? Because a lot of their biodiversity impact, as you kind of mentioned as well in this conversation, sits within the supply chain, within an organization. So what have you found, or where rather, have you found some of the biggest hidden exposures are today? And how do companies go about understanding the ecological risks that are embedded in their sourcing and supply chain systems?
I agree. Like for many companies, their biggest risks are in the supply chain. And it's not uncommon that companies lack visibility into the various levels of their supply chain, let alone the impacts and dependencies within the supply chain. So probably some of the biggest areas are in what are called high impact commodities. So that would be like beef, soy, oil palm. Um, these are massive supply chains globally, that have multiple levels that they go through, like from farm to trader to another trader to a processor to, another trader and then to a market and then to a company who then turns it into a product and then sells it into the supermarket and we make the choices to buy it, right? Like there's so many chains in there. And there are a lot of companies or solutions and approaches trying to create traceability to that to get down to like, okay, well, what's happening on the actual farm? But I think that the traceability challenge is problematic for a couple of reasons. One, when you're talking commodities and they go into processing facilities, you lose the traceability full stop, right? So I don't think you can actually trace a commodity through the supply chain in a systematic way, at least not with current affordability of technology anytime soon. Um, but again, it comes back to the how much information do you really need to act? Um, and we know a lot of information. Like companies have easy access to information about which impacts they're sourcing that are high impact commodities. And they can start questioning in their supply chain to the suppliers, where is this commodity coming from? And even if they can't get to a specific farm, they can at least identify where the resistant suppliers are, the ones who maybe don't want to share information for various reasons. Maybe they don't have it, maybe they don't want to share it. Maybe they don't want to share it for legit reasons, maybe they don't want to share it for not legit reasons. Um, but that is already a lot of information in itself. And again, the goal here is not to just create traceability and to create more data. The point is to act, right? And we have plenty of data about supply chains and about these high impact commodities, plenty of data to take action. So now the question comes back to around incentives, right? If a company is truly incentivized to act on the information that they have, they can already make a huge difference. If they don't have the incentives, it doesn't matter how much traceability we create, they're still not going to take action. So it really comes down to the incentives to address the supply chain risk, or the risk overall than it is around the data. But in the meantime, there are a lot of companies still working to provide more data and more accessibility to that data within the supply chain. And our solution is one of those, right? We actually make it pretty easy to understand, what is the impact or the potential impact of commodities that you source, et cetera.
All right. So one of the things I find striking about the IPBES report is that a huge portion of companies' biodiversity impacts it's not in its own operation, but deep within its supply chain. And you talk something about sourcing commodities, right? So for a company that sources commodities from, let's say, the regions with extraordinary biodiversity, and we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, where do they even begin to map their exposure from?
So the first question around mapping the exposure is the first step in general is to do a self-assessment, right? Like do a risk assessment to benchmark where you are, to identify your risks and opportunities, and to prioritize what should be acted upon. So that's the point of these double materiality assessments, which is like look across the full landscape and figure out what's the biggest stuff, and then start working on the biggest stuff first. Um, Similarly, when you're working through the supply chain assessment, you can just start with, okay, what is it that we're buying and from our suppliers, and which of these things we're buying are on these high impact commodity lists. So we know at least that we can narrow down and say, well, these are lower risk. We can set them aside for now because this is the high risk stuff. And when I'm talking about risks, it's not just the impact of that commodity itself, but again, like the volume or like how much of that commodity do you depend on for your business, right? Like does if soy is hypothetically speaking 99% of your business and you know that soy is a high impact commodity, you can connect the dots with like this is really material for us both financially from the scale of our business perspective because if the soy like if regulations or requirements around soy start to complicate our supply chain, that could increase costs, that could materially increase costs for a business. So like you need to spot that. Like where do we have our biggest exposures? Then you need to go and be like, okay, which suppliers are we working on? How are our suppliers doing in terms of assessing soy related risks within their supply chain, right? So is it something that they're already building transparency around or not? Do they have any knowledge of the fact that there are these biodiversity risks related to this soy trade that they are a part of? So I think once you've identified your priority areas, then you engage that first layer of suppliers on how they are addressing this. Again, asking them for information like where do you get it? How do you verify that it's not driving land conversion or deforestation? You know, how do you validate if it's organic or not? Like there's a lot of different levels of transparency and questions and governance that you can ask each of those suppliers. And you'll start to form a view of who's on top of this, who's managed things responsibly. That's great. That's less of a concern than companies that don't know what they're doing and need help engaging, or maybe problematic and actually, know that they're contributing to deforestation or land conversion in the supply chain. And that's where you want to engage. And a lot of companies, when they're getting started and they find risk, like their first question is, oh my gosh, does this mean we need to divest this? Like, no, right? We don't want to like disrupt the economy and just like throw everything out. We want to transform the economy and educate people on how to align social and environmental outcomes with financial outcomes. So the idea is figure out where in your supply chain you need to engage. Because, and I don't think I've said this exercise is not about reporting, right? Like, yes, certain entities, investors, regulators want to see reports, but the reports are evidence that you're doing something. And your reports, if you just check a box with a basic report, that is evidence that you're checking a box, right? That's not evidence that you're addressing nature risk. If you're getting into your supply chain and you're speaking to your suppliers and you're helping them learn and you're cascading this like knowledge and these business practices down your supply chain, that reflects in what you then report and tell back to investors and regulators, and they can see that you are being proactive and being or trying to become like nature positive or at least reduce impacts on nature. So the again, like you, driving for full transparency in the supply chain to create a report, that's not really the outcome. The outcome is where do we need to engage? And you can always ask a few more questions and collect enough information to understand where in your supply chain you need to focus next. And as you kind of work your way through, right, those dark spots or red spots will appear everywhere you go, and you'll be able to kind of compare them if you're being systematic about the assessments.
Fantastic.
Let's bring in the geopolitical dimension into this conversation because it's something that is under discussed, right? Because we are living in a moment of increasing fragmentation where there are trade tensions, there's conflict, there's resource competition. How are these many dynamics affecting the biodiversity today, particularly within the global supply chain? And do you think companies are actually factoring this into their risk models?
To answer your last question, no, but they're starting to because
Okay.
it's, it's becoming financially material. So I think probably one of the best examples today is the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. And you have all of these fossil fuel energy sources that are stuck and not able to go to the countries that need them for energy. And you have this realization amongst countries for sure, and hopefully, like I don't know how much is cascading down into companies yet, but it should be cascading down into companies to realize that a highly concentrated global economy is a high risk global economy because if you have just a few channels to key supplies and one or more of those channels becomes disrupted, like everything can stop. Well, I don't want to say everything stops, but everything gets hard for a bit, right? Um, and it highlights the fact that there are few key sources for these inputs for the system that we've set up, right? And the system that we've set up is on purpose like that. You get economies of scale when you concentrate all this activity into like one or two or three companies or from like one or two or three high producing places. But when one of those goes offline, then it becomes very expensive to have this centralized system, and you see the value of shifting away from the centralized system to a decentralized system. And now countries are like, oh, we should actually be investing more in solar, not more natural gas, right? And we're starting to see, new fossil fuel plants that were being invested in to be taken offline or to not be implemented, and shifting those investments instead to something that's more decentralized and renewable. I think when it comes to nature, we're going to see more of that start to unfold. Our food system is also highly centralized, actually. More than 90% of global grain distribution goes through just four or five companies, right? Like that's a huge concentration risk in my perspective, not very dissimilar from what we see around fossil fuel supply. So a few of those disruptions have happened, right? We've seen spikes in cocoa. We've seen spikes in a few other commodities. And I think companies are starting to realize that having this highly concentrated value chain can be problematic. It's cheap when it works, but it's expensive when something breaks down. Like it's high risk. So they're looking at diversifying and be like, okay, maybe we should have more sources of this or more backup plans for how we're going to address revenue in case we can't get these commodities. Um, so long story short, I think that when there's a global disruption, it helps people, it helps companies and leaders realize, like the concentration, while it's super cheap, is actually expensive when it's disrupted. So let's use that calculation to apply to actually we need to do more decentralized kinds of things. Additionally, when it comes to looking at the food value chain, right? That's where nature gets really important. So a lot of the cacao price increases is related to climate change and climate impacts, but also biodiversity. So the climate change, let me back up. Uh, Cacao trees are more susceptible to climate impacts when they're not farmed in a regenerative way, right? So if you're very exploitative to the land and you're just trying to crank out as much, cocoa as possible on a piece of land and essentially degrading that land to, get more output in the short term, then you get climate change coming along and it just wipes out all the trees because they're not healthy, and they can't withstand the reaction, or the weather event. But that's what regenerative agriculture is now trying to do. So we've seen enough of that climate impacts, the loss of crops, impacting global commodities for many companies to realize, look, we need to change the way that the farmers are doing the farming so that the system that we have, which is decentralized, so we don't even have access to the farmers. So they're trying to figure out like, how do we penetrate through this centralized system to get to the individual farmers that are actually providing the food that we need globally, and then helping them to understand how to do regenerative farming, which essentially is a nature positive style of farming. And I'll just make one last comment around like farming in nature. Farming is super, super dependent on biodiversity, but it also competes with biodiversity for land. And part of this, the value of this regenerative agriculture is recognizing those complementarities and ensuring that there is enough natural land to continue to provide the biodiversity that farming needs, but then also you can farm in a way that enriches the biodiversity on the farmland itself. Um, so I think these, kind of global disruptions have forced a lot of companies to look at and realize that biodiversity is material within the value chain, and these disruptions have forced them to kind of think about how they penetrate through this centralization uh, to get that knowledge and that investment to the places where it needs to be done.
Fantastic. I think we've spoken a lot about supply chains, we've spoken a lot about risk, which is obviously very important. But I'm curious, beyond risk mitigation, where do you see some real commercial opportunities for companies that do prioritize biodiversity?
This is my favorite topic, is the opportunity side. So the reason that I got interested in sustainability in the first place, eons and eons ago, I don't want to say, um, is that there's enormous opportunity in reinventing our economy to align social and environmental outcomes with financial outcomes. So we kind of take it for granted how our industries work, but our industries were never like someone sat down and said, this is how this industry should work to have the most beneficial outcomes. These industries just kind of evolved, right, through various incentives and opportunistic things that happened. And they actually can be redesigned deliberately to align social environmental outcomes and to truly maximize value for society, um, which means reinvention. And as an engineer, I'm like, oh, well, why don't we just go reinvent all these industries? Like, how cool would that be? So if you look at in history, these, you know, revolutions, like these industrial revolutions, right? You have literally the Industrial Revolution, you have the Green Revolution in farming, you have the Digital Revolution. Like all of these revolutions unleashed enormous opportunities in like new companies, new jobs, new value unlocked, and new things possible. And this is a revolution that will come through not because like, oh, we discovered a new kind of resource to exploit, but it's more like we're dealing with a new kind of constraint, which is the planetary boundaries. And those constraints force us to innovate. My favorite comparable to this is uh, the COVID pandemic, right? If you asked somebody before the COVID pandemic hit, oh, there's going to be a global pandemic, everything's going to shut down, most people are going to have to stay at home, you know, what do you think will happen to the economy? They'll be like, oh my God, it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a total economic collapse and meltdown, and blah, blah, blah. And that is not what happened, right? We put the constraints and people innovated. Like humans are so good at innovating around problems. So if we embrace these constraints, right, there's going to be a massive amount of innovation, and that innovation is going to bring about the sustainable economy or the next revolution to the sustainable economy. Um, and every business has this opportunity, right? Businesses that their whole business model is environmental destruction need to take a really serious look at redefining what they do and figure out how to move away from that. But most companies provide, things that we need and things that are good. And they can now ask themselves, how do we do this better in a better way? And that starts with, well, understand where you're having those impacts and dependencies so that you can focus in on, all right, let's invest in innovations that help reduce risk and uncover new financial opportunities for us. So a couple of examples that I've heard or seen. There was an electrical distribution company that, spent a lot of money on maintenance around their what are they called? The power lines maintenance. Because foliage takes over and trees, pull things down and start wildfires. And so they did an experiment where they used nature-based solutions to address this by, instead of going in, cutting all the trees away, they went and planted low-lying native vegetation underneath the power lines. And those low-lying native vegetation took hold and were successful and created like a continuity in the ecosystem. So ecosystem continuity is really, really important. If you cut a road through the middle of an ecosystem, you don't have that same ecosystem just divided in half. Literally both, you have two ecosystems now and they both degrade. So if you can keep that connected, so they did that, they kept it connected through native species, but also because they were low growing, the other plants, couldn't easily move in, and so their maintenance cost drops because they didn't have to go out and cut down trees all the time. And they were like, this is incredible. It's a win-win. Like it saves us money and it's an amazing story around biodiversity. Let's do this in other places. Similarly, a very famous computer company set an, uh, an internal challenge for their engineers to kind of reinvent their laptop, but it has to be like zero emissions. And that was emissions focused, zero emissions, but you can't make it more expensive and you can't compromise on quality. It has to be essentially the same laptop or better at the same price and zero emissions. And the engineers loved this challenge, right? As an engineer, I would love that challenge. Like, what's more inspiring than reinventing something that is not like only awesome, but is also good for the planet, right? And you just proved to the world that this is possible. So they got super inspired and they did amazing things and made amazing contributions to reducing that company's carbon footprint. And there's like infinite of these kinds of opportunities. Literally any company can sit down, just start to educate themselves on nature and start to look where are the risks, where we need to invest in protecting our business and preparing for resilience, and where are the opportunities for when we become the sustainable company in the sustainable future, and how do we lead doing that so we can be first to market or set the example or whatever that might be, get access to green financing. Like there's enormous financial benefits to pursuing a nature positive business model.
Speaking of benefits, right? You were part of the team that built the climate sense, which ultimately got acquired by S&P, right? And you think, right, that nature data and analytics market is leading towards a similar consolidation, or is this $1 trillion sector in the making so that I know where to pay my attention to?
I think there will be consolidation, and here's why. Um, Especially large companies, but any company, I would say, want a simple solution, a single solution that can help address all of their needs. That's not always possible. But similarly, in the climate space now, it's even more so in the nature tech space or the biodiversity space. Um, these challenges are so complex and so diverse that you have a whole bunch of startups. Like the nature tech ecosystem of startups is enormous and very diverse because all of these companies are addressing a different component of it, right? We're at the beginning of a company's journey, helping them map out their impacts and dependencies, develop plans, action plans, whatever. Then you have the next step of, okay, now we need to implement these plans. We want to do an ecosystem restoration to help, protect the watershed we depend on. Like, how do we do that? We need some project developers. Now we need to make sure that this project investment is being successful. We need to do on-site assessments and monitor the biodiversity and blah, blah, blah. So there's so much to be done here. But they're all technically different and very technically specialized. So each of us kind of focuses on a different piece. And if you look at our position in the market, we are very much focused on this like nature, having the best nature risk assessment solution that is scientifically robust, comprehensive, fast, scalable, and affordable. Like we're trying to be able to put nature insights in someone's, at every business leader's fingertips. By with 2 data points in 2 seconds, they can get really deep nature insights on which they can act with like, here's what to do with that. Here's the next step. But that's a very deep nature piece, right? And then you have these companies that across do ESG in general, that like look at nature and climate and reporting and all this kind of stuff. So you have like the generalists, and then you have climate, and then you have people that do the data collection, right? You have IBAT as one data provider, but there's a lot of startups doing data collection as well. So it's kind of a mishmash of solutions right now that for a single company, they're having to go and piece it all together. And I think you'll see consolidation over time as bigger companies or smaller companies join forces to provide more comprehensive solutions in the space, because I think that will be easier for most companies to do adoption. The early adopters are the ones who are like, ah, this is cool. I want to try that one. I want to try that one. I'm going to bring these together. I'm going to build my own solution. But over time, like most companies will be like, what's the best solution for me for all the things that we need to do? And then that's when you'll see the consolidation happening so that those solutions can essentially partner up to develop a more comprehensive offering.
So this biodiversity loss, right? It affects regions that are, I would say, economically vulnerable, right?
Mhm.
And there are communities with the least power when it comes to the global supply chain, and least representation in corporate boardrooms, right? How do you think companies should think about their responsibility when it comes to managing these nature-related risks? And do you think there's a justice dimension to this?
Um, so we think a lot about this actually, and we've built a communities. We built, I call it the human component of nature, right? Helping companies understand where their environmental impacts are impacting communities as well. And we see that as a central part of the story, not a side part of the story. Um, I think for global companies thinking about communities, one, we need to tell that story for them so that they do connect the dots, right? Because again, they've got a lot that they're dealing with, and if you have one solution that presents the complete picture, that's better than them having to think of and ask the questions themselves. But companies have the ability to destroy distant communities and the ability to protect distant communities through the actions and the decisions that they take and the questions that they ask within their supply chain. Um, Definitely corporations in like the wealthier countries um, and the people in the wealthier countries too uh, make decisions that create incentives that drive ecosystem destruction in less wealthy countries. And actually, many of those are critical ecosystems that are still intact, that are making the greatest contribution to addressing the climate crisis, and that those companies should want that those ecosystems to remain intact, not only for their benefit, but the community's benefit as well. So there's all these like knock-on risks and knock-on benefits to how a company thinks about nature and its value chain. But I think it's really important that companies do incorporate communities as part of their biodiversity assessments. And a lot of the guidance does include those. Not all the solutions include them, but the guidance often includes, oh, and by the way, there's communities here too. Don't forget about them. Um, but there's there's an incentives problem, right? Um, to not care. So it's a frustrating point.
Yeah,
It's
I
a
hear
frustrating point, especially because we spend a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about
Yeah.
how do we prevent our platform from being used in a negative way, and how can we build equity into our platform for communities. Um, so I don't know. This wasn't a very good answer, I think, to your question. But
No,
there's
please.
definitely impacts. Like, I don't think people realize how much their individual decisions can impact distant communities, but they should think about that. They should think about this holistically as not only, this is about climate change, this is about ecosystems. Nature is it's not the same as climate. Like climate, when you emit carbon dioxide anywhere, it affects everybody. And those who have less ability to build resilience are have greater impacts from climate change. But ecosystems are local. And so it's more around, are you making decisions that would drive remote or distant ecosystem impacts in your value chain, which is very different because you're getting all the benefit of that while someone else is getting none of the benefit. I guess in that way, it's similar to the climate impacts. But you can drive local ecosystem destruction from far away in another country through the decisions that you make as a business leader.
And sorry, just to add to that, do you think the TNFD, which is like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, right? You think they adequately account for the communities who are mostly affected by the risks it's trying to measure?
I don't. I'm not saying that as a criticism to the
Yeah.
TNFD in any way. I think that doing nature and people, like doing nature without people is hard and complicated, and they've done a good job, and they have done, I think, a good job of recognizing that there's the communities component that needs to be brought in there. And they have. So in the first draft, there wasn't a strong component of communities. In the final draft, there was a strong component of communities. Um, there's also, if you look at like the regulatory guidance and stuff and the reporting frameworks around this, they also treat communities and humans as separate. So it's more in a social category than in the biodiversity category. And I think that creates a separation in how companies think about biodiversity impacting communities is because there's like the community side and there's a biodiversity side. But what about the Venn diagram overlap of communities and biodiversity? So the TNFD has accounted for that to some extent. I think there's a lot more work that can be done. I think there's a lot more. We know there's more work that can be done on our side, and it's something that is high up on our list and we want to do. And and there's so many subtopics within there, right? That you can, if you can connect the dots for companies, you can give them levers to pull to reduce their impacts or to actually help empower those communities. So I think there's an enormous opportunity there to strengthen that connection on through the like providing the risk lens and the opportunity lens to companies, something that's definitely on our radar. It is there, but there's still a lot more to do.
Fantastic. So, even though we don't want to round up the conversation, we usually like to ask our guests if they have, a piece of advice for some of our audience members listening. So, for some of the business leaders that haven't acted quite yet on, understanding their risks or even addressing the opportunities in this space, what would you say is the most strategic first step that they should take in integrating biodiversity into their decision making?
I have strategic first two steps.
Okay, we'll go with that.
So the first is around mindset shift. Many companies think about this as like, oh, this is another compliance thing I have to do. I'm going to have my ESG people do the assessment and look at the report. That is very low value for the company. Like nature risk and climate risk, these are material. This is important stuff. It's important for every business. So leaders should recognize that we are in a period of change. There's an interesting book that I am listening to called The Other Side of Change, Who We Become When Life Makes Other Plans by Maya Shankar. And I've only read the first couple of chapters, but she basically sets out that if something is happening to you, and right now we have a planetary crisis, right? And it's happening to businesses. Something's happening to you, and you try to keep your life the way it was, or you try to go back to the way things were, you will have a very difficult time with the adaptation. If you look at this as like, this is a new world, a new frame, a new set of circumstances that we have to work within, change becomes much easier and you can actually start to reverse the narrative. And so that's the first step, is change the mindset from, yet another obligation to, oh, here's an opportunity to build a better business and to embrace the fact that these changes are here, right? So how do we build a better, more resilient, more sustainable business facing the reality that we have. And then the second step is start with the benchmarking, the baselining, like do the initial assessments around climate risk, around nature risk, to really understand what it means for your business. Because once you do that, the pathways start to unfold and it becomes much less intimidating project to take on. So if you ask any nature person, like where should companies start? They're always like, just start with getting started, right? Like pick up the TNFD, contact a solution provider, like, just start working on something. And as you learn, the true pathway that you need to follow or pathways available for you to follow will start to emerge. And it will become its own thing and it will roll. And you don't have to worry about pushing it up the hill anymore. It'll start rolling down the hill and carrying you along.
Fantastic. Just start.
Just start. And a strong mindset.
Yes. Yes, that too.
Awesome.
That too.
Wow.
Awesome.
Wow. Thank you so much, Megan. But before we let you go, there's something we'd like to do on the podcast, right? We want to give you your flowers, right? And because I think that conversations like these, one that we just had, sometimes can sound abstract, right? We're talking of frameworks, we're talking of regulation, we're talking of data platforms, risk model. But I think behind all of this is a person who has looked at one of the most complex problems on earth and said, I'm going to make this legible, right? I'm going to make this something that a CFO can act on, that a supply chain leader can use, that a board can understand. And I believe that this is not a small thing. It takes someone like yourself who has built courage to be able to do it, because you came from Goldman Sachs, from Morgan Stanley, from the acquisition of the climate service by S&P Global, and you had every door open to you, and you chose to build something from scratch, which I believe because you believe that the private sector could be a force for nature, not just a force against it. And I believe, that rigor which you're pursuing is exactly what this planet needs more of right now. And you said something that will definitely stay with me. You said that the challenge is not motivation, it is clarity. And I believe that companies need to act on it, because we all have a role to play. It doesn't make sense to say, well, I have no business about this, so let me just put my hands away from it. And so for that, well, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the clarity that you brought to this conversation. And I'm also 100% sure that our listeners will find this, for people who are not familiar to this side of the conversation, will find this very enlightening. And so I want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And to our listeners, whether you are a sustainability director, a CFO, a board member, or someone who just beginning to understand why nature matters to business, we hope that this conversation has given you that clarity, and we hope that it gave you something to start with. Just like you said, start. And so thank you, Megan. Thank you truly for the work that you do, for the mission that your organization stands for, and for this conversation. And definitely I'll be looking out for more of the amazing things that you and your organization do. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for those kind words. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate the work that you do as well. So thank you as well.
All right. Thank you so much. With that, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. See you next time.
See you next time. Lovely to meet you both. Thanks again. Bye.